Hello, welcome back. Today's lecture is going to be a brief overview of the Cold War. The Cold War, just to give you a little bit of context, we're talking about the time period post World War II into really, America kind of thinks until the late 80s, early 90s. I think Russia, the former Soviet Union, still thinks it's going on today. But the idea is the world has two superpowers post World War II: the capitalist democracy in America and the communist dictatorship in the Soviet Union. And those two world powers are trying to exert influence across the globe. Both sides really kind of think that, the world isn't a big enough place for both of those ideologies, right? In America, we believe in economic free choice and equality of opportunity, which means that, everybody should have the same opportunity to work hard, get an education, take risks, and, the harder you work, the smarter you are, the further you can climb along the economic ladder. Which means some people will become filthy rich, some people will become in the middle class, and some people will be in the lower socioeconomic status region. On the other side, you have the communists who believe in equality of outcome, right? Everybody's equal, everybody gets treated the same. The government decides how much you can make. There's no real economic free choice. You do the job the government tells you to do. You get the house the government tells you get. The idea is everybody gets treated equally. There's implications to that. If you have a little bit more than your neighbor, then the police will come in and either take it from you or arrest you, or because again, you would be greedy and a capitalist trying to take advantage of other people to get yourself ahead. And so these two ideologies are going to be battling each other throughout the Cold War. And they both sides have different views of what the world should be like. The Americans really want self-determination, which essentially means democracy across the world. We want people to be able to vote and have a say in their government. The communists don't believe in self-determination. It's essentially one-party rule, communist rule, and anybody who's opposed to that gets silenced. Because remember, you can't. You can't allow people, if you really want equality of outcome, right? You can't really give people the freedom to oppose that. And so, those people get silenced. There's going to be competition between the two countries for resources around the world. America, for capitalism really to work, we have to constantly be growing the economy, which means making more stuff, selling more stuff. And, for that, we need raw materials, and we need to have countries that are willing to buy our stuff and trade with us. For communism's not really interested in international trade as much, but they're looking to be self-sufficient. And so what they're doing is looking around the world for opportunities to get their hands on raw materials for their own economy. So the difference really is, the Americans are going to be trying to trade for that. And now we're not saints in that, right? We're going to try and get the best deal possible. And there's some swindling going on there occasionally, but for the most part, it's free and fair trade. The communists, on the other hand, to fuel their economy, are essentially going to be taking raw materials from the areas that they have control over and using it for their own economy. The two sides both have different views about the way Europe should look after World War II. America really wants a thriving Europe. Again, like if you're a capitalist economy, you really want everybody to do well, because the more money that that the Europeans make, the stronger their economy is, the more likely they are to buy our stuff. And so it's, this kind of mutually beneficial thing. If I want to make money, I got to make sure other people are making money because they need to be able to buy my stuff. Whereas communism, the communists don't want Europe to do well. They've been invaded by European countries a couple of times now. And so, they want Europe as weak and divided as possible. And so they're going to be, trying to make sure that the areas that they influence aren't strong enough to resist them. And then same thing for Germany. America wants a united, strong Germany. We recognize that if Germany is able to choose its own future, then Germany will choose to be an ally with America. The Soviets, on the other hand, they know that too. And so they want a divided Germany. And remember, in the previous lecture, we talked about Germany is divided into 4 zones. And the Soviets will want to make sure that Germany stays divided as long as possible. So they're weak and they can't potentially invade Europe again. Can't invade the Soviet Union again. So we have these competing interests, and really tensions start to rise right after World War II. There's this brief period where everybody kind of hopes that there will be peace after World War II and the two sides can get along. What you're looking at here is a picture of Soviet troops and American troops meeting at the Elbe River in Germany. And so the two sides, right, invaded Germany from the opposite ends, and they, kind of met in the middle. And so, this picture is American soldiers greeting Soviet soldiers, shaking hand and like, ooh, look at us, we're all friends. Well, that lasts only a second because the leaders of the two countries recognize that, we were only friends during World War II when we had a common enemy in Hitler. And now we don't have that common enemy anymore. And tensions are going to immediately start to rise. So what's the background? Well, both the United States and the Soviet Union believe in their own superiority militarily, politically, economically. We believe our version of government is better than the other's version of government, and the two are going to start to try and push their system all across Europe and all across the rest of the world. Now, the two sides are at odds, right? And so, but America and the Soviet Union are never actually going to fight directly. That's why we call it the Cold War. If the two sides fought directly, that'd be a hot war, right? The two sides won't fight directly for influence, but there will be fighting through surrogates. And so that's why we call it a Cold War, because there's no direct involvement between the two. Those surrogate wars can be, the best examples are going to be Korea and Vietnam. So there's never actually any fighting between the two nations, but we will be aiding allies, in their fight against communism. The Soviets will be aiding their allies in their fight for communism around the world. And a lot of that's going to be pretty controversial because in reality, America wants to promote democracy and self-determination. But even more than that, we want to stop communism, which means sometimes we're going to be supporting really great democracies like in Greece. And sometimes in, Central America and South America, we're going to be supporting dictators over communists. So a great example of that's in the Middle East and Iran, where we'll support the Shah, who's a bad dude, just because he's not communist. And so, there's some positives and negatives to this. So nuclear weapons are actually going to be the thing that really prevent any direct confrontation between the two sides. Now, initially in this conflict, the Americans have nukes and the Soviets don't, but because the Soviets have spies in the United States, they're going to be able to develop a nuclear weapon relatively quickly. And that's when we get to a concept called mutually assured destruction, or MAD. And the idea is this, like both sides have enough nukes to completely wipe out the other side. And so the two sides, it's not worth risking going to war over, right? If we, decide that we're going to go to war to make sure Poland stays a democracy and not become a communist country, the consequences can just escalate out of control, and then everybody can end up dead. And so we're not going to be able to really solve our problems with the Soviet Union through direct military force. We're going to have to use a concept known as brinksmanship. And brinksmanship is essentially like playing chicken with diplomacy. It's, you're going to essentially maneuver your diplomacy to the point of disaster, right? You're going to push as hard as you can push without actually tipping the scales towards war, to try and get the other side to back down so you can get what you want. And so I'm going to read this to you. I know my little box here has cut out some of that definition, so I'm going to read it to you. Brinksmanship is the practice of maneuvering a dangerous situation to the limits of tolerance or safety in order to secure the greatest advantage, especially by creating diplomatic crises. So the idea is, push it to the limit, try and get the other side to back down so you can get what you want. The best example of brinksmanship is the Cuban Missile Crisis, where, Kennedy lays it on the line and says, we're going to get the nukes out of Cuba. We're not going to allow missile bases to be installed. And if you don't do this, then we will go to war. And, we're talking World War III, all bets off kind of deal. It's the closest the world gets to, nuclear war ever. And, the Soviets will back down. Khrushchev is going to look at that and say, oh, crap. I guess I better do what the Americans want and back down. Now, America is going to look pretty strong in that situation. We'll talk more about that in the previous lecture, but I just want to point out it's not like we totally just punked out the Soviet Union. We also secretly agreed to remove our nukes out of Turkey, and so the Soviets do get something out of that event. But the idea is the same. It is brinksmanship. It's making, pushing things to crisis level to try and get the other side to back down, and so you can get what you want. And so that's going to be a major tool in the Cold War, but it's a tool that's going to be really kind of scary, and it's going to create a lot of fear in both America and the Soviet Union. So, what are the causes of the Cold War? Well, one, the United States is definitely afraid of Soviet expansion in Europe after World War II. It's pretty clear Stalin, when he liberates Germany, he moves through Eastern Europe, and his forces are there, and they're not going to leave. And FDR essentially said, all right, you can have it, during the war. And it's not that FDR just gave up. I don't think that's a fair assessment. I think FDR just recognized the political reality that it would require war to get Stalin out. So he says, we're not going to fight that battle. But then it becomes clear that Stalin senses weakness in Europe. He knows that their economies are wrecked and that their militaries are destroyed. And, he really has kind of plans for the rest of Europe. And so America's afraid of that. It's one of the reasons why we drop nuclear weapons. It's because if we didn't, to protect Europe, we would have had to keep a large standing army in Europe, which would have been very, very expensive and something that the American people wouldn't have wanted to do. We dropped the bombs on Japan, so we don't have to invade Japan and have up to 1 million casualties, but also to send a signal to Stalin that says, we don't need to keep a large military in Europe. If you invade those countries, we can wipe you out through nukes. And so, that's going to create tension, this aggression in Europe. America is going to want to expand its markets, right? Capitalism, we got to constantly be selling stuff. America post World War II is making way more stuff than we can just sell to ourselves. So isolationism and this idea that we can just be self-sufficient and mind our own business, the Monroe Doctrine, that is completely out the window now. We are an international economy, and we need to constantly be looking for new people to sell our stuff to. That's markets, right? And so we're pushing for that around the world. And the more communist countries there are, the fewer countries we can sell stuff to. The communist countries aren't trading partners with us. And so, capitalist democracy spreading around the world means more people that can buy our stuff, and, more people that we can buy cheap goods from as well. So, we want to limit the expansion of communism so we have more people to sell stuff to. The Soviet Union is is, really honestly concerned about European aggression. I think that's a legitimate fear. Germany's invaded them essentially twice within one generation. They're sick of that. I mean, I think I probably would be too. And so the Soviet Union wants to make sure that that doesn't happen again. So they want to create a buffer zone in Eastern Europe of satellite nations, so countries with puppet governments that are sympathetic to the Soviets, that those puppet governments act as a barrier if European nations want to invade them again. And so you've got to, if Poland is a Soviet satellite state, if Germany wants to invade them again, they have to go through Poland, fight the Polish people, which gives the Soviet Union enough time to react and defend itself, so it's not as easily attacked. And so the Soviets want weak Europe, and they want a buffer zone so they don't get invaded anymore. And then the Stalin is just upset about America. He feels betrayed by the Allies. He was begging for a second front for the majority of the war, and the Soviets were doing most of the fighting. I think in history, because America, the American history books really like to promote the idea that America saved Europe. And that's not untrue. It is true. But, we couldn't have done it without the Soviets. The Soviets did the majority of the fighting. It was the Soviets that broke the Germans' back. Now, America could have done that, but could have and did do it are two totally different things. The Soviets broke the Nazis' back, and then the Americans stepped in and just kind of cleaned up afterwards. And so Stalin did the majority of the work. And, it came at a great cost. Excuse me. And so because it came at such a great cost, he wanted a second front sooner, and so he could save lives. And we put it off and put it off and put it off for good reason, because we were afraid a cross-channel invasion might not work. And then, if it didn't work, then it might be a decade before we could attempt it again. So we wanted to make sure we got it right. But Stalin always took that personal. And then the second thing he's upset about is the dropping the bomb. He's upset for a couple of reasons. One, he was kind of in the dark. I mean, he knew about it, but he knew about it through spies. And so, Truman and FDR just weren't upfront with Stalin about it. And he feels like, well, I thought we were friends. Why wouldn't you tell me about this? And then the second thing is, he feels like, well, why didn't you drop it on Germany, right? That was, our enemy. We should have been able to use it against Germany, and that would have saved Soviet lives as well. And so he's upset about those two things. So one of the first people that really recognizes that the world, after the defeat of the Nazis, is just immediately gone into this next crisis is Winston Churchill, right? Winston Churchill, again, he saw the danger of fascism before anybody else. He also saw the dangers of communism before anybody else. And he gives a speech in Fulton, Missouri, and essentially lays it out. And he says, look, communism is bad. It is, it's this brutal type of government. And think about it, like, anybody who disagrees with the state in the Soviet Union ends up in prison. Dissenters, intellectuals, people who kind of, are more susceptible to challenging the government or ending up in jail. There are the Stalin's purges have killed millions of people. And Churchill sees, look, the difference between Hitler and Stalin isn't much. It's essentially just a label. And so he says that this is this evil, Reagan will later say evil empire, but, that's essentially what Churchill's saying. And then he points out that the Soviets aren't just bad for their own people, that they're on the rise. And he talks about how an iron curtain has descended across Europe, and the Iron Curtain is all of the Eastern European border states to the Soviet Union that have become Soviet puppet states, right? And so as soon as the Soviets they have elections, they're completely rigged. The Soviets make sure they install sympathetic communists, and the Soviets are essentially exercising control over these states. And these states have now isolated themselves from the West. They've shut themselves off from the West, and this is the Iron Curtain he's talking about. That you can't, the West can no longer see what's going on over there. People's liberties are being stepped on. The wealth of these European nations are being just sucked out and sent to the Soviet Union. And, Churchill's warning against this, that we have a new enemy, and we need to, be afraid of what's happening in Eastern Europe. Now, the Iron Curtain is not an actual wall. I feel like some people get confused sometimes. The Berlin Wall, later, that we'll talk about later in this lecture, is an actual wall. The Iron Curtain is just the border states, those satellite nations in Eastern Europe that have, essentially democracy has been dismantled and puppet governments of the Soviet Union has been installed. And so Churchill's the first to warn the world about this, and he does it, right over in Fulton, Missouri. This is a political cartoon kind of showing what Churchill is talking about. So this guy right here, that's Winston Churchill. I always feel like in cartoons he looks like a pug, the dogs. He's typically chewing on a cigar. And so the political cartoon is talking about Winston Churchill's Iron Curtain. We can see this right here is a curtain made out of iron. You can see the rivets in it. No admittance by order of Joe, and it is descending across Europe. And so it's cutting Europe in half. Churchill is trying to sneak a peek under, but he's the one that's raising the alarm, trying to figure out what's going on over there. And the Iron Curtain is not only dividing Europe in half. You can see it's cutting in half a railroad track. Railroads are representative of trade and communication and travel. That's being cut off to those nations. Those nations are being isolated. And you can see at the top there are armed guards. There are people trying to escape and run away, implying that what's going on the other side is a bad thing. It says no admittance by order of Joe. Joe is Joseph Stalin. And so, alarm bells are going off, and people are, starting to pay attention to the expansionist part of the Soviet Union. So there we see that there's a number of things that are increasing tension around the world, and primarily in Europe between the two powers. One of the major sources of tension is Poland. You have to remember Poland is super important to the West. Great Britain and France, essentially went to war against Germany to ensure the sovereignty of Poland, right? And so when Germany invaded Poland that, the major world powers stepped in and said, no, Poland needs to remain free and independent. And so we went to war, and, tens of millions of people died to protect Poland. And so when the war is over, the expectation is Poland will again be free. Well, it won't be, because the Soviet Union went through Poland to get to Germany. And so there are Soviet troops there. And so, Russia is no way going to let Poland go. Poland is security to Russia, right? They've been invaded through the Polish corridor twice in one generation, and they're not having it anymore. And so, Stalin will say he's going to have free elections, but he will install a puppet government there that is a communist government, and horrible things are going to happen to Poland, right? The wealth and natural resources are going to be extracted out of Poland and sent to the Soviet Union, and the Polish people will suffer for it. And the West is going to always kind of look at Poland like it was a failure on their end, because it was why we went to war in the first place. Same thing with these other Eastern European nations. You can see the photo right there. The Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany. All of those, that's the Iron Curtain. All of those are those border states to the Soviet Union that have puppet governments installed. And so, FDR had to really allow the Soviet Union to control those areas because we would have had to go to war to stop them, and nobody was prepared for that. It would have been a tremendous cost in, men and material. So the Soviet Union just kind of gets that. Well, in a world where the West wants to see more and more self-determination and more democracy and more capitalism, the loss of these countries is just stinging. The Soviet Union wants to have a sphere of influence over those countries, again, as a buffer zone for the rest of Europe, and to be able to extract their wealth to be able to fuel their own economy. So here's a larger version of that map so you can kind of see what's going on. The countries in like the tan color, those are neutral nations. Interestingly enough, Yugoslavia there, it is communist, but it does remain neutral. It's actually, when these other states that become communist, Romania, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, those have puppet governments installed, rigged elections. Yugoslavia is not. Yugoslavia actually wants to be communist, and they're their own version of communist. So the Yugoslavian government won't be at the beck and call of the Soviet Union and of Stalin. They that's the thing about when you're serious about self-determination and democracy, the people get to vote, and in Yugoslavia they actually want to be communist, and so but they become communist, but they're not a puppet government of the Soviet Union. All right. The next point of contention between the West, and the United States, and the Soviet Union is going to be over Germany. Germany remember, it's been divided into essentially four sectors. We're going to have the British sector, the French sector, the American sector, and the Soviet sector. And then same with the city of Berlin. And so, we have divided Germany into four. Sorry, got ahead of myself. We've divided Germany into four. The Western sections, the democracies, really quickly want to unite Germany. They want to unite Germany because they know, one, they don't want to have Germany be dependent on them all the time. They want them to be successful and self-reliant, so we don't have to bear the cost of keeping their economy afloat. But also because we know that they're potentially going to be allies to us. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, wants the opposite of that. They want Germany weak at all costs because Germany's invaded them twice. So they want to keep them divided, keep them weak. They don't want to see a thriving economy there because, the stronger their economy, the stronger they are industrially, the, greater capacity they have for war. And so, the Soviet Union doesn't want that. And so the two sides will be butting heads there. And we'll talk about how that manifests itself here in just a little bit. All right. And so the other part about Germany is, the idea about what Germany's economy is going to look like post World War II. Germany has been one of the industrial powerhouses in the world. And because of that, they've been able to build, very formidable militaries, right? And so you got a lot of factories. You can build a lot of planes, tanks, and submarines. And so the idea initially was during World War II to turn the German economy into an agrarian economy, take away their industry, all major industry, right? Minor industry could say, but all major industry, take it away, dismantle it so they can't build planes and tanks and submarines anymore, and turn them into an agrarian economy, a country filled with nothing but small farms. That plan is called the Morgenthau Plan. Morgenthau Plan, he's the United States Treasury Secretary that comes up with the plan. He's Jewish, and so he's not a friend of Germany. And he comes up with this plan to be able to do that, to dismantle the German economy. And so the Russians like that plan initially because they're always afraid that England and the United States could end up siding with Germany, and if Germany is strong, that they would have to fight Germany. So they want to keep Germany weak to make sure that they don't get invaded again. FDR is all for that too because he doesn't want Germany to be aggressive anymore, and he really is upset with the fact that Germany, how long they resisted, and he wants to make sure that the German people know that they're defeated, right? That it's, look, this is the second time you've done this. We've shut you down both times. Don't do it again kind of mentality. And so that kind of makes sense. I think that if I was a world leader back then, I would probably be pretty upset at Germany too and want to punish them to the point that they couldn't do this again. But then all of a sudden, particularly FDR and the Western democracies start to realize, well, that's what we did after World War I. That's what the Treaty of Versailles did. It tried to punish Germany so harshly that they could never make war again. And well, what did that end up doing? It made the German people, who are normally pretty rational people, very educated. They had a tolerant democracy in the Weimar. They were punished so much that they turned to any strong leader they thought could help get them out of this crushing poverty. And that strong leader ended up being Hitler. And so, you want to find out how violent somebody can be, back them into a corner. And that's what the Treaty of Versailles did. And that potentially could be what the Morgenthau Plan does as well. And so what we'll see is that the Morgenthau Plan never gets adopted because of that and other reasons. Russia very, very much backs off the Morgenthau Plan for a little bit different reason. Germany owes them money. Small farmers don't make money. I mean, the reason why we wanted to make them small farmers in the first place is if they're subsistence living, growing enough food just to survive, they can't, they won't be internationally aggressive. But the problem is if they're small farmers, just barely, just growing enough food to get by, they can't pay back Russia the money that Russia's owed. And, Russia's in a tight spot economically. Their first 5-year plan was successful. After that, it was disastrous. We'll talk about that later in later lectures. But the reality is Russia's just not in a spot economically to, not be able to get that money back. So they need Germany to have industry so they can make some money to be able to pay back that debt. America doesn't want Germany to be dependent, right? They don't want Germany to be dependent on us. That's too expensive. And so we want them to be independent. And we recognize really quickly that the Germans are, hate the communists. And so they want to be capitalist. They want to be democracy. And so if they're strong, that's just another strong ally for the Americans. And so, we want them to be strong for that reason. So the Morgenthau Plan, ultimately, both sides say, "Nah, we'll scrap that and we'll let industry exist in Germany." So how do we start? We set up the tensions, we set up the problems. In the previous lecture, we kind of established, the setup of what Europe is like through all these different conferences. Well, how is it that we're actually going to combat communism during the Cold War? Well, the first tool that we're going to use is the Truman Doctrine. And so Truman comes up with a policy that is it's designed to combat communism. Now, Truman plays it really smart. Right, he gives a speech that essentially lays out what America's position is, but he gives the speech in a very diplomatic way, so as not to upset or be too combative against the Soviet Union. And so, here's what the Truman policy is. I'm going to read this to you real quick and then kind of explain to you what it means and why it's a coded message. The U.S. should support free peoples throughout the world who are resisting takeovers by armed minorities or outside pressures. We must assist free peoples to work out their own destinies in their own way. right? Essentially, what he's saying here is we're going to support democracies against any kind of armed minorities or communist takeovers. This is smart because he's not saying communism. He can look to the Soviet Union and say, oh, this isn't about you. It's about armed minorities. And it's not really about democracy. It's just about free peoples. And so the coded language is free peoples, means we're going to support democracies and try and spread democracies all throughout the world that are resisting armed minorities. So any kind of, civil war where there's communists versus, democracies, like in Greece, we're going to come in and support the democracies, or outside pressures, right? So if, the Soviets are trying to, support communists in countries like Turkey through, monetary aid, the United States will try and do the same for the democratic capitalist elements. And so, it's really just this idea. The Truman Doctrine is just this. It's we're going to support democracies and capitalism around the world with our resources. And the first example of that is going to be in Greece. So Greece is fighting a civil war between the communists and the capitalists. And so the civil war has been going on for a while now. And back, back in the day, FDR essentially was, in talks with Stalin about, what's going on in Europe, and FDR essentially says, "Look, if you." Churchill and FDR, I should say, Churchill primarily. Churchill makes an agreement with Stalin that says, "Look, the West won't stand in your way in Romania. If you want to install a communist puppet government there, we'll let you, but back off of Greece." And Churchill initially, and Great Britain initially, become the protectors of Greece. Well, as time goes on, the communists, Stalin actually makes good on his promise, by the way. He doesn't provide direct aid to the communists in Greece. The communists in Greece are primarily a homegrown thing, like people who legitimately want to be communists, but they're fighting, against the nationalists there, the democratic element there. And the fighting is tough. And after World War II, Great Britain is no longer in a position where they can afford to help the Greeks. And so Churchill essentially calls up the United States and calls up Truman at this point. FDR's died, and calls up Truman and says, "We can't afford to continue to support the democratic elements in Greece, and we're going to have to back up. And you're going to have to do something about this." Now, Greece is important symbolically to the West because it's the cradle of democracy, right? It's where, democracy was invented. And so if it falls to the communists, that's going to be a huge blow. And so Truman says, "Okay, gotcha," and starts to take over from the British and to support the democratic elements. And eventually the democratic elements will beat the communist elements, and Greece will become a democratic nation. The next area the Truman Doctrine gets used is going to be in Turkey. Turkey is strategically incredibly important and very important to the Soviet Union. You can see in the map right here that this is Turkey. The Soviet Union is on the other side of the Black Sea. And so the Soviet Union is, it's not landlocked, but it's kind of landlocked. It doesn't have access to very many warm water ports. And so if it wants to be able to ship goods in and out, those goods, a lot of them have to go through the Black Sea. Well, the Black Sea's got two very narrow straits. One is the Bosporus there, and the other's the Dardanelles. Well, Turkey controls both of those straits. And so essentially, Turkey could pretty easily stop any ships from going through those straits. So the Soviet Union has to make sure that doesn't happen, because that could just be devastating to their economy. And so they really start to try and influence Turkey to become an ally. And the West also is, we want to stop the spread of communism just in general, but we also trade a lot through the Dardanelles. It's one of the most strategically important areas in the entire world. And so the United States wants to maintain influence there too. Well, the Turkey is being run by a really smart politician named Ataturk. It means father Turk. And he's going to play both sides off of each other. And so essentially, he's going to say, look, Soviet Union, I want to be your friend. I don't want to be your enemy. In America, I want to be your friend. I don't want to be your enemy. And he's going to be like a kid that wants, when a kid really wants to get something from mom and dad, right? You go to mom and you ask, and if she says no, then you go to dad and ask, and hopefully he'll say yes, and then you get what you want. That's what Ataturk ends up doing in Turkey. And so he needs some money. And he goes to the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union is willing to give him some. And then he goes to America and asks, and Truman is willing to play that game and is going to give millions of dollars to Turkey to make sure that they stay friendly to the United States, and they will. And Turkey will ultimately, even though they're playing both sides, Turkey is going to move very significantly towards America's side. And, there's going to be some things that Turkey does that we're not going to agree with. One of the things they do is symbolic to keep the Soviet Union happy, is they make their national flag red, right, with the crescent moon and stars. And so, red is the international color of communism. And so their flag looks very, very similar to the Soviet Union's flag. And so, that's Ataturk saying, yeah, we're taking this Truman Doctrine money, but hey, we still like you too. And look, our flag is just like your flag. And so Ataturk does a really good job playing the two sides against each other. So, Truman, between Greece and Turkey, is going to be giving over $400 million in aid to those countries to make sure that they stay friendly to capitalism and democracy. And it's going to be successful. It's going to be very successful, as a matter of fact. All right, the next major tool that we're going to see that the West uses, that America uses in particular, is going to be the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan is an American plan, and it is very simply a European economic recovery plan. The idea is this: it's money and goods that we're going to ship to European nations to make sure that their economy is going to be strong. And that's important for two reasons. One, when countries have bad economies, they are more susceptible to communism, right? And so when people start to get desperate, the idea of communism sounds really appealing, right? Take from the rich, give to the poor. Well, on paper, that looks great. And so if you're starving, right, and you, like, your economy is terrible, that's a very appealing idea. Never mind the fact that when you redistribute wealth at that level, wealth redistribution is economically can be a very good thing, but done too much, like in communism, it can completely wreck economies. And so, but people don't think that when they're desperate. When they're desperate, it's take from them and give to me because that's what I need to survive. And so the West knows that. And so we don't want to see weak economies in Europe. And so pumping in money and goods into the European economy is going to keep those countries, happy. Middle classes hate communism and socialism because the idea is that the government's going to take all the stuff you made sacrifices for and worked really hard for and give it to other people. And so if you want to keep people from being socialist and communist, you make sure you have a strong middle class. And, to do that, you have to have a thriving economy. And so we're going to provide, all kinds of money and goods to Europe to make sure their economy is good so they can resist communism and socialism. The other thing it's going to do is the stronger the European economy is, the more money they have, the more of our stuff they'll buy. And so there's this kind of direct benefit that America gets too. Plus, a lot of the goods that we send over there, we're going to purchase from American companies. And so, just this is just an example off the top of my head, and not an actual example, but the it holds true. Say we're gonna, build a school in England. Well, maybe what we do is we hire an American company, send them over there to build it, right? That American company hires a bunch of English people to build the school, but ultimately the school that we're paying for, the money goes to an American company. And so that company profits, and the materials that we buy to build that school, we buy from an American company, here at home. And so the wood and the cement and the steel all gets bought from America and American companies. And so the Americans benefit because an American company got to keep the profits, and American supplies were purchased, helping all the secondary and tertiary companies. And then Europe gets the benefit because the American company hired European workers to build the school, and they get a school out of it, and so that they get to use. And so everybody kind of benefits there. Same thing for bridges and roads and sewage systems and all that kind of stuff. And so we offer this money to every European nation that needs it, including the communist ones, right? We're playing a game here with the Soviet Union, and we're trying to get people to pick capitalism and democracy over communism. And so this is a PR win. We look like the good guys. Hey, we'll give this aid to everybody. We even offer it to the Soviet Union. They decline because they know if they take it, it makes them look weak and fewer countries will want to side with them. But one communist country does take it, and that's Yugoslavia. Remember, I told you they're independently communist, and so they're willing to accept that money. So at least one communist country does take Marshall Plan money. Now, there are going to be critics at home that are going to complain about the Marshall Plan. There are still some isolationists. The majority of the country is not anymore. But these isolationists say, why are we spending money to help Europe? That's them over there. We should be spending that money domestically. And so when you take a look at this cartoon here, you see that Europe is in a boat. The boat is sinking, and Europe's trying to, bucket the water out of their boat so they don't sink. There's a guy in the middle with aid that's supposed to be America, Uncle Sam with the Marshall Plan money, the aid, and isolationists holding back that man with the aid and telling, with his hand up saying stop. And he says, why should we help? The leak is in his end of the boat, right? So why should we help the Europeans? They're the ones in trouble. We should use that money here at home. Well, the cartoonist is trying to send the message, we're all in the same boat, right? This idea that economies can be isolated anymore is just, it's a fallacy. It can't be true. We're all connected. We sell too much stuff to Europe. If the European economy fails, that's going to hurt the American economy. And so it's essentially saying the isolationists aren't seeing the big picture. If we let Europe fail, the entire boat goes down, which includes America, including the isolationists. So Marshall Plan, we send massive amounts of money. Great Britain will get about $2.8 billion. France will get about 2.4. Italy, 1.3. West Germany will get about $1.2 billion. So it's a massive amount of money that gets sent over to Europe, which is great for America too, because it shores up their economy, which means new markets for American goods. They make money. They buy more of our stuff. And the Europeans are going to be better able to fight off communism and socialism. Again, if as soon as you work hard and you accumulate a little bit of money, there are it's the idea of equality of outcome becomes less appealing because there are people that have less stuff than you. And so if you're going to be truly equal, that means that the people who have less than you can take your stuff. And so, the best way to fight against that kind of philosophy is to make sure people are successful. And that's not to say greedy, right? We want equality of opportunity. We want everybody to have the shot to get an education and everybody to have a shot at working hard, and then be able to accumulate things over time. And so if you do that, you're much less likely to buy into this idea of extreme wealth redistribution, right? Even in America, in capitalist countries, we redistribute wealth, right? The rich pay more in taxes than the poor, and so I forget, the top 10% pay what, like 80% of the taxes, so there is wealth redistribution, but wealth redistribution to the point of equality of outcome to make sure everybody has the exact same stuff, right? Generally speaking, the middle class, just generally speaking, will reject that idea. All right. Stalin is going to criticize the Marshall Plan. He's going to call it dollar imperialism, essentially saying, well, America is just using their money to conquer you instead of their military, like the old imperialistic way, right? Well, that's not true, but there's truth in it, right? Are we using our money to manipulate other countries to kind of do what we want them to do and behave the way we want them to behave? Yes, that is true, right? I mean, you see that happens all the time. Like parents use allowances to manipulate their kids to do what they want. That's not in and of itself. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Now, will we, use our economic weight to push people into bad trade deals and countries into bad trade deals, and for them, good for us, bad for them? Yeah, there will be some of that. There's no doubt about it. We're not innocent in this. But it is voluntary, and at the end of the day, America is going to use its economic might to do a whole lot of good in the world, and particularly in Europe post World War II. And so this idea that we're dominating these other countries with our money, there is truth in that statement, but it is not a true statement, right? It is mostly not accurate, but all right. And again, like I said, the Soviet Union was offered Marshall Plan money. They did not accept it. Yugoslavia did. So one communist nation did take Marshall Plan money. But the Soviet Union really couldn't accept that aid because it would have looked too bad. Now, later on during the Cold War, we will be providing aid to the Soviet Union, wheat and things of that nature, because their economic system just eventually ends up collapsing. All right, here's a chart of the different kind of things that we provided during the Marshall Plan. Like I said, it wasn't all money. Food, fuel, cotton, machinery, all that stuff is sent as well. And a lot of that stuff is going to be bought right here in America. And so, there are some economic benefits to the United States as well. So, one of the first major events of the Cold War is going to happen in Germany. Remember, we talked about the tensions rising in Germany because of the division of Germany. Germany really, it becomes an experiment in economic philosophy. You can talk about comparing capitalism and communism all day long, but you very rarely get apples to apples. An apple to apple example of communism and capitalism. In Germany, you do, right? And so, it really becomes this, example for the world about which economic philosophy is better. On the western half of Germany, you have a capitalist democracy, right? And that's equality of opportunity. If you work hard and you get educated, you move up the socioeconomic ladder. There's lots of movement there. It has some downsides, right? If it's based on the economy is based on equality of opportunity, that means there are going to be some winners and there's going to be some losers too. And so it is definitely not equal, right? Everybody has the equal opportunity, but not the equal outcome. Well, then on the eastern portion of Germany, you have communism, which is about equality of outcome, right? It doesn't matter how hard you work, you don't get a raise, right? And so everybody gets paid the same. And so that's an oversimplification, because it is an oversimplification. But for the most part, it doesn't matter, what you want to do or the risks you're willing to take economically. You don't even have a choice. The government decides for you. Doesn't matter how hard you work. You're not going to get a raise, because then you'd have more than your neighbor. And so that's equality of outcome. Everybody gets the same stuff. Well, really quickly, what you see is the West rewards hard work and innovation. And so, all kinds of new businesses pop up to fulfill different people's needs. And so individuals make that choices. And so you see there's, there's excess bread and toilet paper, and everybody's demands being met because there's an opportunity to make money there. Well, on the eastern portion where you have communism, the government decides what gets made. And so, they like tanks and tractors and trains, and kind of forget about some of the daily needs like toilet paper and toothpaste and whatnot. Plus, there's no reward for hard work over there. And so if you're, working real hard to try and get ahead, and the person that works next to you is like, well, forget that. I'm just going to work enough to get by, and you don't get raises. That guy that works hard stops working hard. And so production levels plummet. And so all of a sudden you start to get shortages. There's no reason to work hard because you're going to get paid the same as the guy next to you. And so in Western Berlin, we see surpluses, we see cheap goods, people are making money. On the Eastern communist portion, we're going to see shortages of toilet paper, we're going to see bread lines, and we're really going to start to see the talented, educated class in Eastern Germany start to flee from the communist sector. And so they're going to be rushing out to go to the West, and the communists can't have that. And so Germany really does start to show that, the difference between capitalism and communism, and the Soviets don't like that. They don't like the idea that the entire world is watching, one half of Germany thrive and the other half of Germany fail. And so they're gonna have to do something about that. And so there's gonna really kind of be two attempts to mitigate that. And so the world can't see, all the bad things that are happening. In Germany, if you're a doctor and you spent all this time being educated, and you're living in East Berlin, and you're making the same amount of money as the guy that didn't go to school at all and didn't make any of those sacrifices, you're just not. I mean, you're not going to want to stay in that portion. You're going to want to go where you're going to be rewarded for that hard work. And so Germany's got a problem. And the Soviet Union has a problem. The Soviet Union doesn't want to continue to have one country with those two systems. And so what's going to happen is Germany is going to, sorry, not Germany, the Soviet Union is going to attempt to remedy that. The first thing they're going to do to try and do that is they're going to try to strangle Berlin until the point that Berlin capitulates and becomes communist. The idea is that when Berlin becomes communist, they will, that's the capital. The rest of Germany will eventually become communist as well. They'll follow that lead. And so in 48, when Great Britain, France, and the United States combine their zones in Germany, create a stronger Western Germany, the Soviet Union can't have that. They view that as a threat. And so what they do is that, they hate this idea. They start to blockade Berlin. Right. And so the idea is because Berlin is located in the Soviet sector in Germany, what they can do, the Soviets can do, because they've surrounded the city, they can just shut off traffic, highway traffic. They can shut off, canals, trains, everything going into Berlin. If they do that, they can then convince the western half of Berlin to essentially starve them into submission and get them to become communist, and then hope the rest of Germany follows suit. And so they blockade the roads, the trains, the canals, and all of that. 21 million people in Western Berlin are really left with 5 weeks of supplies. And so Stalin thinks he's got the upper hand. The Americans, if they try to bust through these blockades, that's essentially Soviet territory. That could potentially mean war. But the airspace is free, and so America has to figure out a way. Oh my God, we're either going to do nothing and Berlin is going to fall, and then potentially the rest of Germany is going to fall to communism, or we can attempt something that has really never been attempted before, and that will be the Berlin airlift. And so, otherwise known as the lift. And so, what America's going to do is what the rest of the world thinks is impossible, including the Soviet Union. We're going to start to fly in supplies. We're going to have help from our allies, but it's going to be primarily an American venture here. And we're going to fly in everything that West Berlin needs for the next 327 days. This is no country on the planet except America can afford this. I mean, this is so ridiculously expensive that it will shock the world that America is wealthy enough to keep this kind of thing up for 327 days, because it's literally going to be over 250,000 flights, which means one every few minutes. And we're going to be supplying them with everything that the West Berlin needs: food, fuel, Christmas presents, greeting cards, anything that the West Germans need. And we essentially, it's such a show of force, economic force, that the rest of the world is amazed by it. And really quickly, the Soviet Union recognizes they made a huge PR mistake for two reasons. One, if the Cold War is all about comparing communism and capitalism and which economic system is better, right? Well, America is showing off its vast wealth that was created by capitalism. And so if you're a nation watching the Berlin airlift, and you've got the Soviets and the Americans trying to influence you to be more like them, you're clearly looking at this and saying, well, America's got way more money than the Soviet Union, so I'm going to be like America, right? And so it's a PR mistake in that aspect, but it's also a PR mistake for the Soviet Union, because it really frames who are the good guys and who are the bad guys. The Soviet Union says you should be more like us and we will starve you into submission. They're bad guys. And America that says we see people suffering and we have so much wealth that we can, we'll just be nice guys and keep you guys alive and keep you supplied to support freedom. And so it really frames America and democracy as being the good guy. And so the Soviets eventually realize that they're defeated, and they lift the blockade. That still doesn't, solve the problem that they're having in Germany. That you're able to compare capitalism and communism, and capitalism is looking a lot better than what communism is. And so they're going to ultimately try and resolve that using the Berlin Wall, and we'll talk about that more later. So the next big tool that's going to get used in the Cold War is going to be the world's greatest defensive alliance, and that's NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. NATO is, like I said, a defensive alliance that involves the United States, Belgium, Britain, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, Greece and Turkey, West Germany, and Spain. I mean, it's this huge defensive alliance that essentially says an attack on one of us is an attack on all of us. The reason NATO gets created is in large part because of the aggression that the Soviet Union used during the Berlin airlift, right? Like, oh my God, Soviet Union is trying to strangle the Western Berliners. And so, who knows? Maybe, Spain is next, or Norway is next. And, we don't want that to happen to us. Well, there's very few of these European countries that can stand up to the Soviet Union by themselves, right? They certainly would need America's help, but they're stronger when they're united. And so everybody unites. And the central tenet of NATO is you attack one of us, you attack all of us. So NATO acts as a deterrent against any future Soviet aggressions. You can see here in the map, all the countries in blue are NATO nations. That's no joke. These are some of the strongest economies and strongest militaries in the world, and will very much be an effective deterrent against Soviet aggression. So, against the NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, it is going to be developed in response to the Berlin blockade and the Soviet takeover of Czechoslovakia, where there are supposed to be free and fair elections, and so the Soviets have been aggressive in Europe, and Europe wants to make sure that they deter that as much as possible. So, 15 nations in Western Europe get together to protect themselves. And there's really three purposes that are being served here. One is to stop Soviet expansion. We've talked about that. The other is to stop fascism, essentially. We want to make sure that there's no more dictators rising in Europe, not just communists, but also fascism. And the third thing is to unite Europe and integrate them politically. The Europeans start to realize, they used to be the world powers, and they can't do it on their own anymore. And so they need to better integrate politically and economically. And so NATO is going to help them organize themselves a little bit better. Now, the Soviets can't allow that to happen, unanswered. And so the Soviet Union creates their own defensive alliance. This comes as no surprise to anybody because it's essentially just the European puppet governments that were established after World War II. Everybody knows that the Soviet Union is backing these countries, and so if you attack one of them, you're attacking the Soviet Union. This is not a voluntary defensive alliance, and so these countries are forced into the Warsaw Pact, but it sends a signal that the Soviet Union is willing to resist NATO. So the Warsaw Pact, again, in creation, is created as a response to NATO. The European nations that are involved in this are not in it voluntarily. I think that is significant. When you're fighting for a friend voluntarily, you're probably going to fight, passionately and enthusiastically. But if you're forced to, if Romanians are forced to, fight in Poland, how much harder are they going to put in it? Probably not that much. And so, the Warsaw Pact is. I guess it's a big, scary thing, but it's not as impactful as NATO. All right, that concludes our lecture for today. I know it was a long one. Thank you for your attention. I appreciate it, and I will see you again shortly.